Hello and welcome to the Life by Design podcast, brought to you by Strategic. This podcast is all about helping you live your great life. Each episode will feature insights from our Chief Investment Officer, Doug Walters. Hello and welcome back to the Life by Design podcast. I'm here again with Doug.
How you doing, Jay?
Pretty good. So this week we're going to kind of dive a little bit deeper into your Insights article about complexity and avoiding it. But first, before we get to some of my questions, why don't you kind of give us an overview of this past week and what's to come?
Okay. Yeah, we had, more trials and tribulations on tariffs. And I think, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, that's going to be what's going to drive markets in the short term. You had a court saying these tariffs aren't legal. You had another court saying, well, we're going to put that on hold for now. And, it drove the market up and down for a few days. The reality is this is just going to continue to play out over the next few months. We mention it because it is important, even if it is that same message week by week. We talked last week about how we had an important company reporting, NVIDIA, and really what we were looking for there. Is there any, major negative signs that they're seeing from tariffs or otherwise, and nothing significant hit the wires. Stock did all right, so nothing really to report on that front. And as we're looking at this week, it's really just a little of, a few economic data points. Probably the biggest one is non-farm payrolls, which comes at the end of the week. This is notoriously volatile. So, in fact, we used to have a little guessing game here in the office about who could guess closest, but it is nonetheless important when you're looking at it over time. So, yes, Friday's print isn't going to be make or break, but it's important to understand what's going on in the employment market over time.
Yeah, and I think that's the same with all of this week.
Yeah.
We say it every week. We're not just looking at this week or last week. We're looking from a much broader lens and over time and adjusting accordingly.
Exactly.
So, so sorry for those of you at home that were hoping for something a little bit more controversial, but hey, that's where we are. It's just kind of a little bit of a repeat, but I'm very excited about this next topic. And kind of diving deeper into the topic from this past week's Insights, which was talking about avoiding complexity and kind of some of these things that start to pop up, when the markets are volatile.
Right.
And so, you opened the Insights article this week by noting a surge in less regulated high fee products. So what were some of the signals that were tipping you up that this complexity was becoming a front burner issue?
Yeah, I think what was the tipping point for me is the prevalence of these in my inbox, as well as headlines in the paper, headlines as you're, perusing the internet or whatever your favorite social media sites are. These things have been around for a while. Obviously, cryptocurrency isn't new. Stable coins are not new. Private equity, private credit. These are not new things per se. Some are more new than others. But what is really catching my eye, and the reason especially I'm watching my inbox, is we tend to get hit in our industry by those trying to sell us things. And the prevalence of these instruments trying to be pushed down to us, ultimately trying to get them to our client base, is really what caught my eye. Things that traditionally were for very high net worth individuals, private equity, private credit. I'm seeing it every day in my inbox. And then I think, a slightly, a separate category, obviously cryptocurrency, stable coins, falling into, a very different category of clients and, targets, but still when you put them all together, what do they have common? They're sort of, in a way, not sort of an illegal way around things, but it's just a different way of doing things that has less regulation. And that, sort of puts my radar up, sort of throws up some red flags.
Yeah. And so you had talked about a debate in the Financial Times in regards to stablecoin, and it was in plain English. I was hoping you could like explain this to me, but what does it matter whether how stablecoin behaves? Like whether I think your examples were like a bank, an ETF, or a money market fund. Like what does that matter?
Right. And, I'm not sure I'm going to give you the answer that you want to hear,
Yeah,
but
sure.
for me, there's two reasons, or there's two layers to this answer.
Okay.
One is just generally the complexity or maybe opacity of it, which is driving the conversation.
Mhm.
So, is it a bank? Is it an ETF? Is it is it something else? Is it a money market fund? Is this conversation's being driven by experts in the field who are experts on what a bank is and what a money market fund is, and they're having trouble agreeing and answering this question. And part of the trouble is understanding what lies behind these stable coins. What is the backing collateral? All of this, and that to me that just raises the red flag that if they can't answer this question, the experts in those particular parts of the market,
Yeah.
then there's a layer of complexity here that is concerning. Or maybe it's not complex at all, but it is very opaque.
Yeah.
So that's number one. And two, from a more practical reason, if it is determined that, yeah, hey, these are, and they act like a bank, they basically are a bank, then at some point you would think bank regulators need to take notice and step in
Right.
and start regulating them like banks.
Well, and in regards to regulation and stuff of that nature, cryptocurrencies are pitched as kind of democratizing finance, right? So, what are your feelings about that?
Yeah, I would say democratizing at what cost would be what I would ask. There are other ways, take stablecoin, for example, there are other ways to transfer money, ways that we've all become familiar with through receiving a paycheck, sending money to a friend. These channels exist.
Yeah.
And one of the primary differences between, say, stablecoin and, a SWIFT transfer or ACH is one is unregulated, unprotected. There's no protection for fraud, stealing, whatever, versus one that gives you some protection, some insurance protection, some, you have, legal boundaries there for what can and can't be done. You have legal protections. So that's the difference. So democratization, perhaps, but you're giving up all of these other things. And if you're touting the ease of it, it's free, I don't have to pay anything. Well, there's a reason why you have to pay for the others. You're paying for protection. And maybe if you don't want any protection, that's fine.
Yeah. Well, and in the article, you were kind of drawing some parallels to the pre-2008 structured credit boom.
Yep.
So, like, what's a lesson from that we should be learning today in regards to what's happening now?
Yeah, I think if you think about what happened, it's like very obvious in hindsight what happened in the great financial crisis, and it wasn't obvious at all at the time.
Right.
And I am not by any means saying, I am, flagging the next great financial crisis. But for me, it is the culmination of evidence coming through my email box, seeing articles in the paper, being hit by commercials on the TV, whatever it is, and they all are touting items, products, things that are less regulated, have less internal controls. And to me, that's dangerous. And the parallel, you think about the financial crisis, and you had a loosening of standards. Individuals were able to get mortgages for, with very little to nothing down, second mortgages covering your down payment. And they were able to do that because no one thought, about the correlation risk of putting all of these risky assets in a basket. They thought, hey, we're going to spread out the risk. All right, Jay might default, but Doug's not going to, or vice versa. So we'll put them all on a basket and we'll be fine. But those assets are like 100% correlated. So when they start to go bad, they all start to go bad. Yeah.
Yeah. And just as a side note for listeners, if you maybe you were around for it, but you just don't know like a ton about what happened in 2008, probably the best movie, The Big Short. Great movie. And for me, from my perspective, explained it very well to me with their like little animations, or like they had like famous actors or actresses explaining like the details when they were talking, the lingo in the finance world, but then they would have somebody explain it to you about what they were talking about. So I highly recommend that movie if you haven't seen it.
Right.
As well.
Yeah. So yeah, it's really good. And again, I want to underline the fact that this isn't, this isn't meant to be a scare story in the sense that, oh, there's some pending disaster. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't.
Right. Just
but
a lesson that we get from that. Yeah.
It's the lesson of, as you loosen regulations, as you, sort of let, give markets a little bit, maybe too much freedom, somebody's probably going to pay for that in the end.
Right. And speaking of that, and kind of in line with some of the stuff that you might see in this is, high fees, hidden fees, stuff like that. And so, when we see high fees seem easy to kind of spot, hidden fees aren't as easy to spot. So like, what's kind of some fee traps, I guess, that are buried in some of these alternatives that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, and it's obviously totally different depending on the alternative we're talking about. But let's take, private equity, for example. You usually have a couple layers of what we'll just call management and operation fees. These are just flat fees that come off straight out of your returns. Often there's a performance fee. So if the fund does well, the managers of that fund are going to take a little bit off the top. So, skim off your gains. And those are, I would say, more the obvious fees. And they're not so much hidden. They're written right in the, your offering documents, but it is not obvious necessarily to the layman how quickly those add up. A drag of several percent in performance fees. And then if the fund does well, possibly, 5%, initial 5% off. A typical private equity fund is going to end up having fees around 7% or so. And that is just an enormous bar for those managers to get over versus, just buying an ETF of equities and getting what the market offers you at a very small fee. So those are, I would say, the obvious fees. Sticking with private equity, a less obvious fee is a lot of these have capital calls, meaning they're going to say, all right, we'll allocate $1 million to you, Jay, but actually right now we just need 250. Okay. And then we're going to have, at some point, we're going to have a need for additional funds and we're going to call up to $1 million. Well, what are you doing with that $750,000? You can't invest it in risky assets. You basically have to have it sit in cash, earning a small, single digit per, return. And so it's one thing to look at, oh, how much did my 250,000 do and whatever else I eventually put in. You have to take into account all that cash sitting on the side for however long. So there's these other hidden costs that just make it really hard for us, the end buyer of these funds, to make out. Managers, they tend to do quite well.
Yeah. And so that's great to know. And I know, we talked a lot in your article and a little bit today with crypto and stable coins and stuff, but we talk a lot about the technology. And I know you said this in your article, you didn't want to come off as a curmudgeon and talking down about innovation. So the question I had was like, how do we know the difference between like an innovative, true innovation that's going to be helpful and something that's just there to be complex and confusing?
Right. It is hard to tell the difference sometimes, but it's really, I like to think about it as what problem are you trying to solve? So I am a big fan of complexity when it solves an important problem. To give an example of, let's say someone comes to us who worked at Microsoft, and they come to us with a lot of Microsoft stock, and it is really low basis, meaning if they sell it, they're going to have a huge tax hit. Well, there are complex ways to reduce risk and have a better outcome for that client than having them just hold that Microsoft until either they have to sell it or pass it down. So we can use option strategies, which are quite complex and sophisticated, but we're solving a problem with those, right? The client in the end is better off as a result of applying this complexity. So we're not anti-complexity, but we want to make sure we're solving a problem and not just filling someone else's pockets.
So as a listener, like, what's something that we can look out for that'll help, like, get things on my complexity radar to know whether it's something that's truly beneficial, like you just explained, or something that's just being complex for the sake of being complex or needlessly complex?
Yeah, I think give you a couple answers.
Yeah.
One is, if you can't understand it or you can't talk to an expert and have them explain it to you in a way that you can understand it, then it's probably too complex. But I would say on a much higher level, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And that is a great way to look at a lot of things investing wise.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Doug. I think that was a great talk.
Did it help?
Yeah.
All right.
Of course.
Good.
All right.
right.
Thank you so much, and join us next week.
All right. Thanks, Jay. Take care.
This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Please see the full disclosure in our show notes for more information.